Okay, I'm going to speak very, very briefly and in English, so I hope everybody can follow me. To help the people who can't understand everything, I've made a few simple slides, which I think will possibly help you along. I'm starting with the two words apartheid, which is, as Simone has said, is a word in Afrikaans, and it means separateness or apartness, as you can see at the bottom, and at the same time, the Israeli equivalent, which in Hebrew is written hafrada, and it means exactly the same, and it's used in Israel too, separateness or apartness. Two images which I think are very telling, 41 years difference. The one is Soweto, 1976, and the other one is the West Bank in 2017. Children involved in the struggle. On the left-hand side, you have Hector Peterson, and on the right-hand side, Ahed Namimi, the girl who is on in most of the social networks now. Hector Peterson was killed at the age of 12, and here in this picture you can see him being carried by a friend during a protest in which pacifistic, peaceful protest. Children objected because they didn't want to study the language of the oppressor, being Afrikaans. 566 children were killed in that period. What's happening in the West Bank? I'm not going to comment on Israel. I can tell you, I'm speaking about South Africa because I know about South Africa, and obviously you can draw the conclusions and you can make the comparisons with what you will hear from Salim Bali. Okay? So the references that you will, these are the books that I've been reading recently, and I must really thank the group of students, my students, who've approached me and asked me to speak here and speak in future too, because they've stimulated me to read up and read recent literature about this topic, particularly related to South Africa, which I know quite a bit about, having lived there for a long time, and also obviously seeing analogies and differences with what is happening in the rest of the world, and in particular in Israel. I'm going to start and once again I have to touch on a few points, possibly just terminology, which I think Professor Bali will bring up in his talk. So obviously I'm going to be extremely schematic. And the first question that I'll try and answer is, what was apartheid in South Africa? I can talk for more or less, I lived the period of apartheid. It started 1 year after I was born, 1948. But it wasn't something that started in 1948. It started with colonialism in the 17th century. So from the first moment settlers came from Europe, apartheid was practiced in some way. You agree with that, I think. It became legalized in 1948 with the National Party, when the National Party came into power, and it's quite interesting that it was immediately after what had happened in the Second World War in Europe. Initially it was called apartheid, and later they even tried to use the euphemism of separate development. Development sounds so good, and the only reason was just keep the people separate and they will develop very well on their own. Now, apartheid can be, aspects of apartheid could be, for example, the pass laws. Pass laws means that people, and in this case I'm speaking about a particular group of people, the majority of the people who are actually from Africa, were required to have passes. They were not allowed to move around if they didn't have a pass. You possibly remember Gandhi, the film Gandhi. He was actually involved in burning of passes as a sign of protest against this pass law, which is actually a long time before before apartheid was actually legalized. Group areas, which I'm going to explain a little bit about. It's not going to be very complete, but I can mention a few things. With group areas, people were expected to live in particular areas. So if you were, if you belonged to, and unfortunately I have to use these categories, and I don't like using them, but unfortunately we have to. People were divided up into groups depending on their skin color. Very often it was difficult to tell where you belonged. So some people were classified white, and you could actually see it on their document. Some people were classified colored, and colored people were the people who were of mixed race, and this was obviously the result of, let's say, lots of contact between different groups. Some Indians who came later with more or less 100 years ago for the sugar plantations, and the majority of people, the black people who were the indigenous people of Africa and South Africa. In any case, group areas was something that was enforced in cities, in towns, and later also in the country itself, but I'll explain that a little better. This resulted in forcing people to be migrants, to move from one area to another to be able to work, because very often they couldn't find work in their homes. And then one of the bad things, but that is not the only problem, voting restrictions in South Africa until democracy, and I will talk about democracy from 1991 onwards, or 1994 is the new South Africa. People were not allowed to vote unless they were white. At a certain point they started giving little voting rights to coloured people and Indian people, but black people were not allowed to vote because they were not South Africans. This was the bad thing. They were South Africans, but they were not South Africans for the National Party government. I'm sorry if I get a little excited, and if I lose track, you have to bear with me. Apartheid was enforced in defense of an ethno-nationalist ideal of white South Africa. There was this continuation, I think, of what happened in Germany during the, let's say, the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. But in a certain sense, there was this idea, we are better, we are superior. And for this reason, as I said, people were categorized into 3 and later 4 major ethnic groups. Please note that I've used quotation marks because, as I told you, I don't like this distinction. So we find the majority of people being called native. They were obviously of African origin. White, also known as European, because they were of European origin. Colored, who were a little bit from Asia, a little bit from everywhere. And later also the Indian group. So there were 4 major ethnic groups. South Africa was divided into different zones, and they were somehow associated with particular races. And then, and this is something that you can obviously see some correlation between the other topic that we're talking about, Israel, land seizure and forced relocation, which I'll talk about as we go along. The group areas, as I said, according to ethnic divisions, in cities, in towns, people could not live where they wanted to. So if you wanted to buy a house in a white area and you were black, you couldn't do it. So you had to live in a black area, and these places were called townships. Townships and Bantustans were the 2 areas that were associated with the apartheid period. And the apartheid period, as I told you, started legally from 1948 and ended 1991 and completely in 1994 with democracy. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up as a privileged South African because I belonged to that particular group. I left the country in 1972, so I more or less left when I was your age, talking about the students in the audience. And obviously I had a lot of experience, like most of my contemporaries.